Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 7th webinar in our 2021 series. My name is Brian Harper, and I'm the Director of Communications. We're glad you could join us this afternoon. Go ahead and post in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. As with all of our webinars, we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of this one, so please post your questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on it, so go ahead and post them as they come to you. Note that if you're watching this on the events page of dan.org, you won't be able to post questions. So in that case, you can look at the bottom left corner of the embedded video player, click the YouTube logo, and go to Dan's YouTube page where you'll be able to post questions. All right, let me introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Francois Berman is the Director of Risk Mitigation at Dan. He is responsible for all Dan's safety and accident prevention initiatives, as well as the recompression chamber network. He has traveled around the world to conduct safety assessments at facilities used to treat injured divers and has written 2 books, The Risk Assessment Guide for Dive Operators and Professionals and The Risk Assessment Guide for Recompression Chamber Facilities. Today's topic is a Q&A session with Dan Safety Services. And without further ado, I'll get right into our first question. So Francois, thanks for being here with us this afternoon.
You're welcome.
Having read horror stories of liveaboard fires in recent times, what can I, as an avid but conservative diver, do to help protect myself from being trapped below decks of a boat?
Well, it must be a pretty frightening event for you to go through, and we've seen 2 relatively recent events. But I need to couch that by saying we have hundreds of thousands of boat trips in a year, and it's really every few years perhaps that we have an issue, and very rarely that we have a catastrophic one. However, I think the events of the past have led to us investigating this a bit further. And what I'd like to share with you this afternoon is some of the things that you can do, consider, perhaps prepare for, so that when you go on your expensive, or let's say your long saved up for cruise, liveaboard cruise, you can be at least assured that you're not going to be one of those very unfortunate statistics that we've seen or that we've heard about. Okay, so what can you do before you go? And clearly the key is to be prepared, to understand what it is that you are going to expose yourself to, and try to, before you actually go on your vacation, think about it. Don't be overly concerned in terms of what we've seen in history, but get yourself ready to face some of the realities. Right at the top of this is to do what we very rarely do, and that is to pay attention to the actual safety briefings. And in fact, if the dive boat doesn't give you one, you should insist on one. Your safety ultimately is your responsibility. You may try and pass that on to others, but that doesn't help you in the time of an accident. And then you probably want to find out, especially if you're going to be in a cabin below decks, you want to make sure that they explain to you what the fire drill is, and in fact probably better that you actually do a walkthrough, make sure that you're familiar with where the exits are and that you know where the equipment is that's going to protect you, like the fire extinguishers and the alarms, because sometimes they're going to be located in areas where you might not logically think that they would be. So really important that you are familiar with what you're going to do if there's going to be a fire on board. As important as man overboard or the boat capsizing or sinking, we need to have some basic preparation in place, and the US Coast Guard is pretty insistent about some of these drills too. Okay, so that's what you can do when you're board in preparation for your cruise. And then if you are going to have a cabin below the decks, then you probably want to take a couple of things with you to really avoid those unfortunate situations that we've seen happen. A couple of relatively inexpensive items to take with you, perhaps starting with a portable carbon monoxide monitor or a smoke detector. We're pretty used to these in our houses these days, and all we really want to do is make sure that the batteries are installed, that you've tested it, and that it's relatively sensitive. And that's going to give you an indication not only of a fire, but perhaps exhaust leaking from the diesel engines and other sources of carbon monoxide. But you want to know about a fire long before it gets hot and fast and dangerous for you. And then if you are going to be in an area where it's difficult to get up, or perhaps will take time to get up onto the deck, then a small fold-up smoke hood, as we call it, might be something to consider. They relatively easy to put on. You just perhaps need to read the instructions before you go. And they will give you at least 15 minutes of clean air that you can then make sure that you can get out, get onto the deck and report to your muster stations. And then something else that we advise you to think about, and if you assume that there's an emergency or you hear there's an emergency, sometimes our first instinct is to grab our wallet, grab the laptop, grab the cell phone, and you're going to be thinking of all these things while at the same time there's smoke, the alarms are going off. So why not pack your essential items of travel, such as your passport, some cash, maybe credit cards, and certainly your really important medications into a little grab-and-go bag. And so when you hear that siren, if you hear that siren, then you can grab this, don't get cluttered up with anything else, perhaps put in your smoke hood and head out back to the deck. So really basic things. You really want to just think about it before you go. And we've seen from history that people, once there's smoke, once there's carbon monoxide, is very, very short amount of time before you get debilitated. So just a bit of basic preparation will give you peace of mind before you take that cruise that you've been waiting all the years to take.
All right, thanks for that. Moving on to our next question. What is the most significant event that I, as a dive instructor, could face that might expose me to a legal liability suit?
Okay, this is the sport of the current time that we're in, and that's legal liability suits. And the best way that we can avoid ending up in a situation that could be financially disastrous for us is, never mind the accident, it's to have a well thought through, appropriate, well practiced emergency action plan. And for those of you that have read some of my articles and heard me speak before, you know that I'm really passionate about this particular aspect. It's because it's the accident or the incident that leads to the lawsuit. We only end up being taken to court because something went wrong and we weren't really adequately prepared for that event. Now we get medical emergencies. I think we're pretty used to those in diving. And then we get non-medical emergencies, and we need to think through our situation very carefully before the time. So this is our business. We need to think about what are the risks that we face when we take folks diving, when we charter that boat, and consider that our divers might come with pre-existing health conditions, so that heart attacks and various other issues might before those travelers. And then we know all about diving injuries. That tends to be one of our main focuses. So we have illnesses and injuries. So we could have trauma. Typically what we've seen out there is the cylinder falling on somebody's foot, or somebody having a propeller injury, or something that sparked off our kind of major safety program, and that is getting your finger caught in the diving ladder. Really as simple as that, but if it happens and somebody ends up with a crushed or amputated finger, that's pretty significant, and you know who they're going to blame for that particular issue. And of course, if we have a death on board, that requires very specific planning. It's not going to be an emergency in that you have to rush around taking immediate action, but you need to know what it is that you're going to do. You don't want the next of kin coming back at you for not treating their beloved one with respect. We have boat accidents, and some of these are relatively familiar to us. And as I said in the previous question about fires on board the boats, is the US Coast Guard and other Coast Guards are pretty insistent that we have good emergency procedures, that we practice them and that we document them. And when they come on board to do the inspection, they're going to ask, where's your man overboard emergency procedure, and show us proof that you've drilled that frequently enough. Then we have fires and explosions, not only on the boat, but these can happen in the workshop, maybe in the accommodation that you're providing to your guests. So think a bit more than just the diving event. And then something that I think is often thought about or misunderstood, or perhaps just disregarded, and that is the human interaction. So bad behavior, aggression that people might show towards you, perhaps some degree of civil disturbance. If you think of your guests taking a day trip on a rented motorcycle or a vehicle, being stopped at some roadblock, and the next thing you know, they've been arrested because they don't know what the protocols are. You need to have a plan in place. And if you look at everything that I've described so far, you can see very quickly where those lawsuits are going to stem from. So, plan. Identify what those emergencies might be and put together a realistic emergency action plan, something that you can practice consistently, that you can carry out. It will be effective as far as you can plan for. We can't plan for every eventuality. But what happens if we have an emergency with a proper emergency action plan is that we can mitigate the situation, minimize the injury, minimize ongoing injuries, and ultimately show our guests and our staff that we are prepared as best as one can be prepared, for these things. Now, of course, and I'm not going to end up sparring with any of you learned lawyers out there, but there are no guarantees. That much we have to accept. And when there are accidents, people usually want to blame someone. If you have a sound emergency action plan, you've practiced it, you've got documented proof that you've carried it out, that you've done your best to foresee the possible emergencies, and you follow that plan consistently, then perhaps the plan has some shortcomings, but you've done your best. There's documentation to provide to whoever's now bringing the suit, and you can argue about whether the plan was perfect or not, but at least you can show that you were prepared and you did as much as you can do before the situation before the situation occurs, and hopefully it doesn't occur. When we plan with these things and we think of these emergency situations, they tend not to happen. They happen when we're not planned for them. There's an article in one of the Alert Diver magazines, the first quarter of 2020, where I've explained a lot of this, and there's in fact a webinar specifically on putting together an emergency action plan that is designed to prompt you to think about the things that you might not normally think about. So, that's really what I've seen from the lawsuits, the cases, that's really where it all stems from. There's some bad luck. We can't really avoid that, but there's certainly something we can do to prepare ourselves for that. And that way, hopefully mitigate that wretched liability suit, that never mind feeling bad about what's happened, you now have to be concerned about yourself.
Sure. All right, thanks. Moving on to the next question. Are lithium-ion batteries really safe to use? I read about an incident where a cave diver suffered severe laceration to their leg when a lithium-ion battery pack exploded underwater.
Yeah, this is a topic of much discussion these days, and in fact there's speculation that has been the cause of some significant and catastrophic fires. And I think most of us have seen YouTube clips of things burning in airports, and it looks pretty impressive when it happens, and it can be really devastating too. So I'm going to focus this really on the use of lithium-ion batteries in our scuba gear. So really what affects us as divers. Let me start with saying you treat things with respect, and generally speaking, things are not going to go wrong. Now, it is possible to have an emergency with a lithium-ion battery as a result of a factory defect. So, when there's contamination in the chemicals that they're using to make the electrolyte in the battery, it is possible for the thing to, let's say, self-ignite. But we have billions of lithium-ion batteries out there in use every day, and the number of accidents is actually very, very few. I know they maybe measure in the thousands, but when you're measuring against billions, they're actually very few. It comes down to us as people. It's really related to how we treat those batteries and some degree of knowledge about what it is that we're dealing with. So we start off with regular inspections. Be aware of any sign of distortion, overheating, bulges, leaks, anything that could indicate that those batteries, that battery pack is really in distress. And it's pretty obvious, it's not something that just kind of comes out of the blue. Then look at the wiring, the connections, to make sure that the batteries are really secure in their housing, because that again leads to poor connections, overheating, and from that we end up with wire short circuiting and so on. And then if it's really, really hot when you're charging it, and I don't mean, warm, I mean really hot that you just about burn your fingers, that's clearly not an acceptable situation. A good warning sign, please heed that warning sign. Secondly, just protect them from damage. So if they're going to be loose, you're going to handle them, make sure you don't drop them, make sure you don't put them somewhere where they can be damaged, because mechanical damage, apart from, let's say an intrinsic fault in the battery, is probably one of the larger of the reasons, and we just don't pay attention to these things. We've had so much use out of them that we become completely complacent. Then we come to the one that I think people need to take note of, and that's charging. Now, who of us hasn't bought a kind of really inexpensive charging cable or a plug-in charger that goes into our automobile's cigarette lighter? For smaller consumers, in other words, cell phones and so on, perhaps less of an issue. But if it's your scooter or your underwater camera housing or the light housing, the original equipment manufacturer builds in safeguards into their charging devices, which means they won't overcharge the battery. It'll switch off before the battery gets to, let's say, completely full. And that way it'll prevent damage from overheating if you just leave it plugged in. And that's what we like to do, right, Brian? We plug in our laptop and we forget about it, and days passed, and the thing actually ends up, if you're not using the original charger, being overheated. Once it's charged, remove it. And remember, our batteries work best when they are between 75 to 85% charged. Now, a good manufacturer will fool you. The lights go green, you assumed it's charged, but actually it's about 85% charged. So we're not going to overcharge it. Again, using that inexpensive, let's say, generic charger, we can often damage, especially the higher power devices. Please don't leave your thing overnight on charge, whether it's your laptop, your cell phone. And of course, I have to say that I think most of us have done that. So none of us are saints when it comes to that. And then the last part of this is don't let the battery run down completely. So when you finish using your lamp or whatever it is, then switch it off so that it then doesn't get to the point where when you recharge the battery, it draws a lot of current and, of course, a lot of heat, and that's where some of the damage can be done. And just be vigilant. If it looks like it's in distress, if it's hot, if it starts to smoke, then for heaven's sakes, pull out the charger, unplug the charger, and turn the device off. So that's what I can share with you, some really common sense stuff. We've seen these things happen. They look pretty impressive when we have a fire and things are burning. But generally speaking, you're not going to see that. And the case that you mentioned with the cave diver, that's pretty extreme. I don't want to speculate as to what happened. I've read some of the case history on that. But let's just say that we as human beings have a lot to answer for.
All right, next question for you. We often read about the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning when breathing from a cylinder. I know about motor vehicle exhaust fumes. What else can cause this?
Okay. This is a good question, Brian, and it's been asked obviously of us. And let me kick off by saying motor vehicle exhausts. Actually, it's not such a major issue because these days modern vehicles are fitted with catalytic converters. And when a colleague and I went chasing fires in California a while back, because we'd been asked these questions, does the fire present a danger, some hazard to the filling stations? Mm-hmm. We actually try to, let's say, calibrate our instrument by putting it right at the exhaust of our rented vehicle. And we picked up just about no carbon monoxide at all. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about here is how do we still get carbon monoxide in our breathing gas? And these are fairly regular reports of people that, phone in, call into Dan, call into the medical hotline with headaches and other things that, are related to carbon monoxide poisoning. And we find, the elevated levels actually in the breathing gas. So I've divided this really into two, one not related to the compressor and the other one related to the compressor itself, which is by far the lesser of the two. So the first is thinking about where your compressor intake is located. And when you're doing that particular exercise, what you want to do is look for those non-obvious sources of carbon monoxide. And they can come from what we call incomplete combustion, so heaters and dryers and other things that are burning gas. Things in the kitchen, perhaps overheating the oil, burning the oil. Smokers, clearly when we are smoking our barbecued meats on certain occasions. And then what I would like to say when I talk about fires, and I'm talking about fires on the outside now, for instance, forest fires and other things like that, is the carbon monoxide, by the time you smell the smoke and it gets to us, the carbon monoxide is dissipated long before then. So, a fire that's happening several hundred yards away is unlikely to be a major source of concern for you, but you need to be vigilant and look out for these things. More likely is going to be things like solvents, adhesive, paint strippers, gasoline, and anything else that gives off vapor. Maybe it's not only going to be carbon monoxide, but they're certainly capable of reacting with things and producing elevated levels of carbon monoxide. Another one that is perhaps even less logical to some of us is rotting waste. So your kitchen waste that gets dumped in the trash cans outside. You might have a biomass pit somewhere. It gives off methane, it gives off carbon monoxide. And we certainly, in our kind of walk around, that's what we look for. So here are a good couple of prompts for you to look at and then decide where to put your compressor intake to avoid drawing in those sources of carbon monoxide. So basically, awareness, vigilance in case something happens. If you see something happening, then switch off the compressor and monitor and check whether the cylinders are being compromised or not. The second one, which is I think kind of the default, people tend to think it's the compressor that's caused the carbon monoxide in the first place. And yes, a poorly maintained compressor where the oil is broken down, where the compressor is running really hot because the fins have become clogged up with dirt, they may indeed burn the oil. And if they burn the oil, again, it's what we call incomplete combustion, not very effective, efficient combustion. And carbon monoxide is one of those gases that are given off. And that's certainly not frequent, but we've heard reports, we've investigated them, and we get pretty elevated levels of carbon monoxide. But we can smell that. That's always my issue. You know, we talk about carbon monoxide as being that colorless, odorless, silent killer. Well, when it comes out of a compressor from oil that's been burned, generally there's going to be a fairly acrid smell that goes with that. If the dive operator is not paying attention and they buy a filter element that doesn't have a carbon monoxide filter in it, it's a catalyst called hopcalite, then clearly if there is surrounding carbon monoxide, say we're on a boat and we're running a combustion engine to drive the compressor and there's no carbon monoxide filter element in the compressor filter system, that's pretty hazardous. Also remember that this is not the coverall. A filter with a hopcalite in it is not going to be able to cope with really high levels of carbon monoxide. So if we have a diesel engine running and we get large amounts of carbon monoxide drawn in, that hopcalite filter has a limit to how effective it is. So if you're getting above 50 to 100 parts per million, which is a low number but very toxic for us, then a lot of it's going to go through. And even worse, if we have not paid attention to our filters and the elements have become saturated, which often happens at our dive areas because we like to dive where it's warm and humid, then we can, again, limit the ability of that hopcalite to catalyze out the carbon monoxide. So again, in terms of compressor operators, diligence. And in fact, if it's me and I'm on board a boat and they're running a diesel engine to drive the compressor, my first thing is to say, hang on a second over here, let me go and check where the intake is and to ask them, do you guys diligently check your air quality and do you replace your filters as you should? So just basic diligence. And then the kind of catch-all is to monitor, and the dive shop can monitor, especially when they move their intakes or something changes in the environment, preferably online monitor in real time. And then the diver can take along a inexpensive, portable, these days, robust and accurate carbon monoxide monitor with them. And I know many folks that have actually started to do this, especially when they're traveling to more remote areas and, one is a little bit more concerned about whether it's possible, to get contamination, especially areas where there's no central electricity supply and they rely on diesel generators and so on.
All right. Thank you. So I see that here in the U.S., the safe limit for CO is 10 parts per million. In other countries, like many in Europe, it is 5 parts per million. Does this mean that the limit in the U.S. is?
That's a good question, and I get asked that question, and we have some debate about it. But let's just look at this in context, so we don't overreact to this. So why is there this difference, and is it significant to us? And I kind of call this the US versus the rest, because here in the US, we actually have the most lax limit for carbon monoxide. So our CGA grade E air that we use as our specification for testing has a limit of 10 parts per million. Okay, small number, but we're concerned about carbon monoxide. In Canada, it's less than 5, and in Europe, it's less than 3, and in some cases, it's even less than 2 parts per million. So why this big difference, factor of almost 5 in some cases? So let's start thinking about what are we concerned about. And the first thing is to understand that these limits are measured at the surface, meaning when we take a sample of the gas in our cylinder, these are the limits that we are going to comply with. So when they do the air sample, they're going to be looking at this at the surface level. But remember, when we dive, for those of you that are technically minded, our interstage pressure from the first stage regulator increases. The deeper we dive, the more pressure we need to breathe in. Therefore, the more gas, the more number of molecules. So even a small number on the surface is going to increase as we dive down, the deeper we go. And that's related to the depth. Essentially, if you have 10 parts per million at the surface, at 165 feet, which is 6 atmospheres, you're breathing the equivalent of 60 parts per million. So we try to keep that number low, so when we're at depth, we don't exceed what are, the safe limits. Ideally, we want to keep it below 60 parts per million. I mean, ideally, we want to have none. Right. Okay, that's the kind of the goal. But as you can see in this table here, 60 parts per million, the table values are really meant to be for longer time exposure, so not 1 hour of diving that we do. And if we go really deep, our diving time is actually even less than that. But 60 maybe to 75 parts per million at depth is the limit that we want to make sure that we don't exceed. So remember, that's at depth. Okay, so if you think about it this way, whether it's 3 or 5 or 10, it's not really so much about a number as why is it there? And the background carbon monoxide is generally going to be 0. It's about point something, in terms of if you look around the world. But when it gets to 1 or 2, it indicates there's a source. Now, maybe it's a spurious source, something passed you by and disappears down to 0 again. But if it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, it's indicating there's a source, and you need to find that source and address it at source rather than waiting to see whether you pass the air quality test or not. So,
very good. On to the next one. Are the hyperbaric chambers located in or close to popular diving areas all safe to use? I know that some of them are meant for commercial diving, but does that mean it could be used to treat me?
And now we're on to my pet subject. When you introduced me, you see that I've traveled around a little bit and seen these things. Let me tell you that they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and applications and variety of conditions. But the question that we as Dan need to know is, if we're going to refer a diver to a recompression chamber, is it safe? Are they going to get a suitable treatment? Is it going to be a safe treatment? Are they going to get the desired result that they want? So as I say, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And bear in mind that in a remote area, they're not going to be treating that many people. It means they're not really going to be able to buy something absolutely dedicated to what we call recompression chambers. So yes, we will use decompression chambers, recompression chambers. One can go into the difference between those, but I don't really want to bore you with all those details. But really, any hyperbaric chamber that can go down to 3 atmospheres, or actually 2.8 is where we like to be, is suitable. So whether it's a single person or a multi-place chamber, we can get a good treatment out of that. I know there's some kickback against what we call monoplace chambers, single person chambers, because we can't get in there to do something. But you can see from the picture at the bottom, that's a chamber that treats divers as well as other patients. But we can get pretty sophisticated in the degree of life support that we can achieve in that. So that's kind of the first part, just telling you, yes, we can treat people in decompression chambers, recompression chambers, saturation chambers, pretty much everything. Okay. What I would like to add on to this is that we have something called the Dan RCN Recompression Chamber Network, and that's our database where we collate information about any chamber around the world that can treat a diver. So that if we hear somebody's in an area and we have at least those details in our database, then we can start to make some decisions. And before I even go any further, let me tell you that what we normally look for, Brian, is there a well-trained doctor? Because a doctor can work miracles with any sort of chamber. If you don't have a doctor, then we start to get pretty nervous, those of us here at Dan. So that's our database. We have a program called the Recompression Chamber Assistance Program, and that's, as Brian said, I've been out all the way around the world, about 150 different chambers that I've visited. And our primary task is to help these folks that don't have, perhaps all the right equipment, but usually the practices and procedures and awareness and training. And these are things that we can certainly give to them. We don't provide equipment, but we provide on-site training and as much support as we can. Mm-hmm. But what we're really doing is we're providing our physicians or our referral doctors with some confidence that if they send that person to that chamber, they'll get a suitable treatment.
Right.
The key is the staff. And we always hear about, well, they've got a great chamber. And let me tell you, from my point of view, I'll go into a really basic chamber if I have faith in that staff contingent. And I've been to some pretty fancy chambers, and you won't find me in those chambers. I get petrified of being locked in there, and the staff are really not paying any attention. Let me just end this part by saying, don't worry about it too much, in the sense that, sure, you might want to know, that there's a chamber in the area. But get yourself or be sent to a healthcare facility where you can be properly diagnosed. Call Dan or have them call Dan. Firstly, it might not be DCI, so then you might end up being treated in a chamber for no good reason. And we have the details. Our database is kept up to date. We make sure we have all the contact details. We know whether they're operational. So give us a shout. We're the ones that can certainly give whoever's trying to refer that person the information that we need. So yes, you probably want to know there's a chamber in the area, but please, not all chambers are equal. And I think at Dan, we have a pretty good handle on where we can refer people to.
That's right. And at the end of the day, we're only going to send people to a chamber that we truly trust.
Yep.
All right, good. On to the next question. I have read blogs, scuba publications during this COVID period about exploding scuba and oxygen. Are these really safe to use, and should I be doing something to ensure my own safety?
Okay, the COVID thing, and that's kind of part of the question that comes up now, is we've heard of so many cylinders exploding, mostly oxygen cylinders, but it's got nothing to do with diving. This is, the shortage of oxygen supplies in many of these countries, and people don't understand the energy that's stored in a cylinder. So let me just take you through a couple of things, try to answer the question for you as the diver that owns your own cylinders, as the dive operator or filling station that is either filling or providing, like you have the cylinders filled somewhere else, and they provide them on a rental basis to their clients. The first is to understand that, hey, these cylinders are designed properly by engineers, and I speak for my profession when I say that, because we bear in mind many things when we do these designs. We look at overpressurization, overheating, corrosion issues, pressure relief devices, and so on. So you really have to mess up to get a cylinder to explode. Having said that, people tend to kind of disregard the energy that's inside that cylinder. So they're pretty robust, and we have to kind of bring that human factor in to mess it up. So what can we do, whether you're the dive center, the chart operator, or the diver, is make sure that your cylinders are inspected and tested regularly. Remember that inspection and test is not going to make the cylinder any more robust. It's simply going to tell us in advance whether we're starting to get in an area where things are not looking as they should look. So they are important, and they're there. They're carefully designed in there. You follow those annual visual inspections and 5 yearly hydrostatic pressure tests. Very unlikely you're going to end up with an issue. The second is to handle them with respect. Now, let me teach you something about respect. The amount of energy that is stored inside a cylinder, if it were to rupture catastrophically, is about the same as a 3-ton imperial ton truck traveling at 70 miles an hour. But that kinetic energy of that truck traveling at that speed equates to the amount of energy that's inside that cylinder if it were to rupture catastrophically. So let's treat these things with respect, because there's more in it than we sometimes think. So some common sense things to think about. We throw them in the back of our vehicle, secure them that they don't roll around. If you hit your brakes, they're not going to move to the front of the vehicle and get stressed on their valves. Keep them out of the sun when they're full. We're going to heat them up, especially aluminium cylinders. They tend to be more susceptible to heat, and under pressure with heat for long-term exposure, it is possible to start to soften the material, which we picked up during the hydro test. So even if it does happen once or twice, we could catch it, but if you continuously leave these cylinders in the sun when they're full, you could end up with an issue. And we've certainly seen that as being the primary cause of some of these catastrophic explosions and failures. When it's not in use, the cylinder's not in use, it needs to be secured. So, I've been into the garage of some of our colleague divers out there, and you see this whole row of scuba cylinders against the side of the wall in the garage. And the vehicle drives in and out of the garage, and the car door could quite easily knock over a cylinder. That's not good practice. So you want to store it somewhere where it can't easily be knocked over, just out of the way, somewhere where it's secure. We do get asked the question, should I store it standing up, which is kind of more hazardous because it could be knocked over, or should I lie it down so that if somebody bumps it, it's going to roll perhaps, but it's not going to fall over? The answer to the question really lies with the design. So we designed the base of the cylinder so that's where we expect the water to accumulate, to be thicker than the walls for corrosion purposes. So if you lie it on its side and there's moisture in there, it's going to corrode slowly as it is on the wall, which is thin. If you stand it up, the corrosion will be where it's thickest and least likely to end up with a failure. So according to CGA P5, which is actually a standard that talks about high pressure cylinders for underwater scuba applications, so that's us. It suggests or recommends that we store them upright, standing on their bases. So basic understanding of the amount of energy that's in there is really the key to all of this. Of course, they do explode, and sometimes it's just really bad luck. You know, there's a fire or it drops from a height because of things outside of our control. But it's really, there's going to be gross negligence. And, you know, each time we hear of one of these explosions, and we get to hear of them, you know, maybe at the moment, once or twice a month. It's crazy what people do. You know, hey, we've been on dive boats where the dive operators are throwing the cylinders at each other to load up the boat when they, you know, they need to get out of there. You throwing around a 3-ton vehicle at 70 miles an hour. I don't want to be around when that thing misses the hands of the guy on the boat. So dive operators, yes, I do have a bit of a thing in the way that cylinders are sometimes handled. So just, you know, be aware of it. They are safe. When they explode, there's normally a very good reason and usually gross negligence.
All right. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the questions that we came prepared with, but of course we expect that some of you have brought some of your own. I see we do already have one in the chat, but before we get there, I want to acknowledge what Francois just put up on his screen. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and thank you especially to Dan members, without whom we would not be able to do this sort of educational outreach. We greatly appreciate your support. Great. Well, shall we move into the Q&A portion?
Yep, catch me out if you can.
All right. Let's see. So one that I see here in the chat is, I'm traveling to a remote area to go diving. Having watched your webinar on emergency planning, please can you help me focus on the most important things that I should consider before leaving?
Okay, so let me kick off by saying congratulations. It's a great question. It means that you've listened to what we try to encourage you to listen to, and you're going prepared, which is, you know, not only going to stand you in good stead, but it's good preparation. You'll think about things and most likely have a lesser chance of ending up in an emergency. So I guess you can divide this into 3 things, Brian. The first is taking along with you the telephone numbers, the contact details that you need. You know, it might be somebody, should be somebody back at home that can come to your rescue to some extent. Your dive buddies, the dive shop, the accommodation, and I'm just thinking ahead now, probably, it depends where you go to. If you're going down to the Keys, we have great emergency services there. You go to some of the islands, they might be a lot more restricted. And remember, on some of these remote areas, we don't have telephones that work. You know, cell phones don't work in every place. And, you know, telephones these days are really not reliable. And there's no internet, so you can't go online and get hold of your travel agent and tell them that they need to kind of reschedule where you're going to. So that's probably the most important part, is to, you know, make sure that you can contact somebody, you know, before, you know, if you end up in a situation. I've been in that situation where they stole my luggage, my computer bag, I lost my passport, my money. And you kind of think to yourself, well, what's the first thing you do? Now, having come from the business side of things, the first thing I did was called my business partner and told her to cancel all my credit cards. Everything else I could live without. Right. But speaking of that, you probably want to carry with you, you know, copies of your passports, your essential documents, put perhaps somewhere else, maybe a spare credit card or 2, so that if something is stolen, then you have a way to kind of start the remedial process. And if you're going to some really remote place, perhaps consider finding out where the nearest consular agent is. Again, that happened to me. My passport was stolen. I was in a foreign country. I needed to get home. And fortunately, I had my computer and the internet, and I could, not my computer, the hotel's computer, mine was gone, find the local consular agent and start the process of, you know, getting myself back home again. So those are probably 2 of the most important things thinking about when you go to a remote area. And just before going to the next question, if you have underlying health issues, clearly you're going to take your medication with you, but be aware that in some of these remote areas you might not be able to get replacement medication, so take enough stuff with you. And maybe their medical care facilities are not going to be able to cope with something that you might go through because of your underlying issues. So probably you want to do a bit of homework and check that they can, you know, provide you the support if you need it.
All right. Next question in the chat. Dan published a series of articles on braided hoses over the past few years. How has the dive industry responded to this?
Okay, So we published a series of articles, and actually the whole issue started with a colleague, a friend of mine, that had had an underwater experience where her breathing hose actually blocked. Fortunately, she could, get her octo, and she could complete the dive and get back safely. So we published the first article, and we were a little bit in the dark as to what the cause was. We could clearly see what it looked like, and one of the readers, a professor at a university, was very interested in this and did some what you call accelerated testing and aging or degeneration testing. And we discovered that it had to do with the material that the hoses were made from. So once we published that and we invited divers to send us the pictures of their hoses, we could see that it's actually, and still to this day, we get reports. Now, the pictures are great, and I've got a great library of what these things look like. The manufacturers have addressed the issue. We know that these date back to 2008, 2009. Many of us tend to think that our dive gear lasts forever. It doesn't. And hoses are pretty robust, but braided hoses perhaps need a little bit more care. So 5 years is probably a good time for a braided hose. So 2008 to 2021, probably time to replace it. But the most rewarding part of all of this, Brian, is the fact that we've had people call in and say, and this is the truth, I was going diving, I tested my regulator on the surface, it wasn't quite right. And then I remembered Dan wrote an article on this, and what did I do? I took hold of my hose and I bent it over, and what did I find? A nice soft spot in the middle of the hose. And we prevented an accident from happening. We've had other cases where they go diving, they have an air out, they come to the surface, and they kick themselves for not actually checking before they go. So I think it's been a great sharing of safety information with the industry, real stuff, divers that face these issues. And you can do your own basic inspections and prevent yourself from ending up in a poor situation.
And not just of hoses, like of a lot of
all
dive
your
gear,
equipment,
right?
correct.
Yeah, even if you're not a certified, gear maintenance professional, you can still do the once over, check it out yourself, and it's a good idea to do so. All right, another question here in the chat. With all the concern and sometimes mixed messages about COVID-19 transmission, can I assume that if I've been fully vaccinated, I'm safe from getting ill from shared or rented dive gear?
That's a tough one. I'll leave that to the epidemiologists and the scientists to tell you what the chance is of you actually getting COVID from some shared mask or piece of equipment. But let me tell you what you should be doing. Okay. So we talk about infection control, meaning controlling how we could get an infection, cleaning things properly. You'll hear us talk about sterilizing and disinfecting and sanitizing and a whole bunch of terms. One of those terms is called cleaning. And let's think now beyond COVID too. COVID is not the only thing you can pick up from shared diving gear. I mean, you can pick up all sorts of bacterial issues, fungus issues, and so on. So when we do share equipment, vaccinated or not, the lessons from COVID, or the focus that COVID has brought to us, is that we should be practicing infection control regardless of COVID itself. So yes, if you've been vaccinated, your chance of getting infected is less, but it doesn't diminish the role you have in taking care of yourself for other things. COVID is actually, the virus is a very weak virus, so it tends to be inactivated by relatively mild disinfectants. So kind of the lesson, I think one of the takeaway lessons from this has been shared rinsing buckets. So if it was me, I would say if you want to have a shared disinfecting bucket with some proper disinfectant in there, that should be fine, as long as it's changed frequently. But you probably want to rinse out your mask and your stuff in the sea or somewhere that's not a shared shared water. And if it were me and I was going diving somewhere, in COVID at the moment, and it's rental equipment, I probably want to quiz the dive shop and see, do you disinfect? And these days they're great. Most of them have kind of come to the party and they disinfect their gear. But just ask them and then take the normal care. Make sure the stuff is kept clean. Cleaning is the most effective way of making sure that things are not transmitted. And we've heard that with COVID, wash your hands regularly with soap and water. It's a great way to get rid of the little guys that do so much harm.
Right, and a lot of the washing is more about that mechanical scrubbing action, or as much about it maybe.
Yes. In fact, the most effective way to disinfect is to wash it with soap and water mechanically to get rid of anything that's kind of significant in terms of amounts of whatever the matter happens to be. And then the disinfectant has the best chance of actually getting in touch with the virus particles and actually inactivating them. Whereas if you've got a whole bunch of gunk on there, whether it's saliva or mucus or whatever else, if you don't mechanically clean it, the disinfectant's just going to see the surface and not really, get into where that horrible little fellow is actually sitting.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. That is the last of the questions I see here in the chat. So
they're going easy on me, Brian.
Indeed. So if anyone else has a question, get it in quick, or we will wrap it up. All right. It looks like that's probably the end of it. So
would you just like to give them our contact details? So
yes.
If they're shy of asking now.
Yes. So if you do have any questions that occur to you later after this presentation, we would encourage you to reach out and email us at riskmitigation@dan.org. And that's the email address that a lot of these questions came into originally. That's how we came to put this presentation together for you. And we would really be glad to have our Safety Services Department field your risk mitigation questions. Please don't hesitate to contact us. Once again, that email address is riskmitigation@dan.org. And once again, we want to thank every one of you for being here this afternoon. Please do know that you can watch this presentation later on dan.org, the events page, or on Dan's YouTube channel. So please, if you found this valuable, share it with other divers you know. And let's see. Oh, here we go. One more question, shall we?
Of course.
All right. In a recent alert diver, you talked about the quarter turn of a valve, how that is fallen out of favor. Is this still an issue in the industry, and is it a cause of accident?
Okay, so when they say the quarter turn issue, it means fully open back a quarter of a turn. Now,
right. The traditional means that a lot of us were taught.
Kind of two schools of thought. I'm old-fashioned and done a lot of work in the gas industry. And if you don't know the difference between opening and closing a valve, and you're about to rely, your entire existence is reliant on the gas coming out of the cylinder, perhaps you should pick another sport. So you should know which is open and which is closed. And there are many parts of the argument. Some people will say, fully open, then I know it's open. Some might say, if it's fully open, you open it too tightly, then you really don't know whether it's open or closed. And if you suddenly have to, if you have to turn off your valve in an emergency, it might be difficult to do because you now, get stuck. And in the old days, with some of our older technology, valves really didn't like to be over tightened when they fully open because it damaged the back seat, and you'd start to get leak in the valve, which means you then have to tighten when you close it. Tighten
and that's
more.
where the idea of the quarter turn originally came from.
So it's keeping no stress on the back seal, the packing seal of the actual valve, which that's how I dive.
Sure.
Okay, I turn it back. But the common way of doing it, the certification training agencies will tell you is just make sure it's open. So we've designed the valves pretty robustly these days so they don't normally get damaged. So make sure it's open fully and test it, please, before you jump into the water. Put the mask in your DV in your mouth, take a breath, look at your gauge, make sure the needle doesn't move, and that's your ultimate check. So we're going to have two schools of thought, and we've, from that article, picked up some pretty forceful folks coming back saying, well, the one is right, the other's not right. Essentially, as long as you know what is open or what is closed, and you're confident that your valve is fully open so that you're not going to have any restriction to flow, then either way really is going to work. If you're one of those folks that rather other people do it for you, then let them make sure it's fully open, and you know that if you know your left from your right, then you should be good. So there's no straightforward answer, but I've kind of given you the background as to why there's debate about this.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, it looks like that is all for the questions. And once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Dan members for your support. And we hope to connect with you in another upcoming webinar soon. In fact, we have one next week, a week from today. That's Thursday the 22nd. We will be talking about lobster mini season and safe harvesting of lobsters. So if you or someone you know is participating in the Florida Lobster Mini Season event in 2 weeks from now, 2 weeks from yesterday, I believe, then please join us 1 week from today to learn a little bit more about how to be safe when you do so. In addition, we'll have our regular monthly webinar coming up on August 19th. We hope you'll join us for that as well. Thank you all for being here this afternoon.
Thank you.